In the wake of the Cold War, a Russian invasion of Sweden was a very realistic case scenario the Swedes had to prepare for. But how was this comparatively small and neutral country going to defend itself against the behemoth that was the Soviet Union?
This was the exact question that would eventually define and shape the way Sweden planned its modern military doctrine.
In order to understand how we got here in the first place, we must take a look at Sweden's position in the early stages of the Cold War. Post-World War II, Europe was in ruins, and consequently it had been split into two separate parts, with the US and its NATO allies in the west and the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact in the east. Although Sweden, who was never dragged into World War II, had adopted a stance of neutrality, and this foreign policy followed Sweden into the Cold War, non-aligned in peace, aiming at neutrality in war.
This was the stance that Sweden took. But in the case of a full-scale war or invasion, there's no doubt which side they would tilt towards.
Without external resources and military aid, Sweden simply didn't have the capability to fight out a war of attrition with the Soviet Union. And since mainland Sweden and especially Gotland were key strategic locations, Sweden would inevitably get involved in the conflict, whether it was neutral or not. But even if Sweden theoretically instantly hopped over to NATO's side in the case of an invasion, it would still take time for equipment and support to arrive, so there had to exist a strong layer of initial defense. In this theoretical case scenario, Soviet ships and landing crafts are already on their way to Swedish shores, and this is where Sweden's critical weapons and communication network came into play. The purpose of this network was to delay a Soviet invasion long enough for the rest of the country to mobilize, and in this plan there were three main deterrents.
At its spearhead, there was the Swedish Air Force that would deploy multiple fighter and attack aircraft, like the J-35 Draken or the AGS-37 Viggen.
With heavy armaments like anti-ship and radar-guided air-to-air missiles, the hope was to delay Soviet air superiority and naval landings on Swedish territory. Since it was predicted that airports could not really be relied upon because of airstrikes or sabotage, an extensive network of road bases were created in order to store, service and rearm aircraft like the Viggen. But even though Sweden had one of the top-ranked air forces in the world, there were no strategies that could make it match Soviet air power.
It was calculated that perhaps even within a few days, the Swedish Air Force would likely already be wiped out completely.
And that's where the second layer of weaponry would pick up the fight. Large coastal artillery would rain down shells after shells, and simultaneously, the Swedish Navy that was equipped with corvettes, destroyers and even submarines would use hit-and-run tactics by taking cover and hiding in the vast archipelagos of Sweden. And all of this was coordinated in deep underground bunkers that were sometimes placed close to the sea line in order to have access to and better conceal the naval artillery. The purpose of this was to create asymmetric warfare, because again, the Swedes knew that they could never maintain a prolonged war. But eventually, through devastating and costly battles, the Soviets would nonetheless reach Swedish shores, where yet another challenge awaited them. The elite unit of coastal rangers, or in Swedish Kustjägarna, would be waiting patiently for the Soviet landing crafts to arrive. Then they would strike as hard as they possibly could and finally use their mobility to quickly disappear. Since these coastal rangers were especially trained in amphibious warfare, it gave them the terrain advantage necessary to have the upper hand. And as a combined effort, these three deterrents that I've talked about so far would work to prevent the Soviets from establishing supply lines or an actual spearhead land invasion of Sweden.
However, if they failed, Sweden would have to resort to its most final and drastic decision: mass mobilization.
At the peak, around 800,000 Swedish soldiers were ready to be armed and deployed, although this would have been a logistical nightmare because every soldier needed to be equipped, fed and transported in the span of weeks, if not even days. This seemed like a monumental task, but supposedly Sweden was ready. Ammunition and logistical warehouses hidden deep in forests in order to avoid sabotage would be opened up. Soldiers then got equipped with their gear and sent off to battle. And these battles were going to be bloody, not only for the soldiers, but also for the rest of the population. Like in any modern conflict, civilians would get hit the hardest, and more likely than not face the most casualties. Cities and villages would get torn up by artillery and bombings. And with the infrastructure being destroyed or made unusable, the army would have to rely on guerrilla warfare, where small units of determined soldiers would have to band together to keep up the fight. even after communication with higher command had been broken off. Although what would happen to the tanks or other vehicles that were heavily dependent on fuel and supply lines, no one really knows. In all likelihood, each individual group would have to do with what they had and make the best out of the situation. But no matter what, surrender or national capitulation was not an alternative.
For how long or how strong the resistance could be kept up is impossible to answer, but the hope was after all to deter an invasion from ever happening in the first place.
Luckily enough for us today, a Soviet invasion of Sweden never really took place. And with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, a new era of Swedish military doctrine would be established. But whether all of this was due to the careful preparation and planning, or simply a consequence of luck, we will never really know.